Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's another of our All Things Africa edition. We continue our series looking at the history of the continents and the regions. We are still exploring North Africa, and we now turn our attention to Egypt. And this one will be split into two parts due to Egypt having one of the longest histories of not just North Africa, but of any African country, and who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our returning champion and tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Abayomi is a historian, journalist, longtime leftist activist, and more. And as always, before we start, a reminder to our audience to please share widely all of One Plus One's content, past and present episodes, our many playlists, and help us overcome the far-right algorithms and the dominant monopoly Western corporate state media and pseudo-leftist websites have in the social media world by sharing our content. Share us across social media and email, and please donate if you can to One Plus One at our PayPal. And if people are having trouble and would prefer an alternative form to donate, then please get in touch with me at yourysmouter@gmail.com. And Facebook sometimes blocks my ability to share One Plus One. So again, please share widely. It helps the show immensely, and it's our only way of overcoming colonial, pro-imperialist, sexist, heteronormative, and racist media. And so now on to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, Egypt, because as I said, Egypt has arguably a much longer history than much of its neighbors and the region of North Africa, and because Egypt arguably has a much longer history, being quite an advanced country, nation state with already quite an advanced civilization. Even before the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Ottomans and the British Empire made contact, and in different ways, they all colonized the people and tried heavily to meddle in their affairs. So my first question isn't going to be what was Egypt like before British colonialism. But do talk to us about what was Egypt like before the ancient Greeks and later Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great semi-colonized Egypt. And Egypt, I know was known for being ruled by an aristocracy and monarch that engaged in slavery and cruel forced labor. They were known as the pharaohs. So talk about them. What led to their decline? Because there's a story that I remember learning about ancient Egypt about the decline of the pharaohs. But I'll ask that as a follow-up question. I'll leave it to you to first to kick us off on the history of Egypt.
It's a very long history. According to archaeological digs and radiocarbon dating, human settlements in the region go back anywhere between 700,000 to 400,000 BC. So that's a long legacy of hundreds of thousands of years. In regard to history, they have broken it up between the pre-dynastic period and the dynastic period. Now, the pre-dynastic period is supposed to convey what Egypt was like before the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were unified. And prior to that, there were already cultures and civilizations in existence in that region of North Africa. For example, the existence of more sedentary societies, agricultural societies, existed in the Sahara area prior to climate change and overgrazing, which they attribute to the desertification of the Sahara area in North Africa. So it's been a long history. They trace back the idea of the pastoral lands, which also had hunting and gathering societies, to more of an agricultural economy, which goes back to around 6,000 BC. You often hear about the Nile Valley civilizations. And as I mentioned earlier, the unification of Upper Egypt, which is in the south, and Lower Egypt, which is in the north. Historians signal this as the beginning of the dynastic period. Now, the dynastic period, in terms of its periodization and chronology, is often cited around 4,500 BC. Some began even earlier than that, up until around 3100 BC. That period around 3100 BC, it has been designated as the most advanced period in ancient Egyptian civilization. But there are debates that continue to go on over the origin of the dynastic period and what existed prior to the dynastic period in Egypt. So yes, it's a very long and very complicated history. And the Nile, of course, is very important because Upper Nile, the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt signifies the direction in which the Nile River flows. And that has been very important in regard to the development of civilizations, ancient civilizations in North Africa. So we also have to look at the fact that modern day Egypt and Sudan, you have to look at it from the standpoint of the actual history of the region. Prior to the advent of colonialism, these areas were considered, much more closer than what you have today, where you have northern Sudan and southern Egypt, things such as the Abu Simbel temples, which existed around the Aswan area, which later became a dam under the Free Officers movement. But we'll talk about that in the next episode. But yes, you have ancient rock drawings, which indicate that there were civilizations in the area going back at least to civilization and cultures going back at least to 10,000 BC. And then, of course, I mentioned the hunting and gathering societies and later the development of agricultural societies in Egypt. So yes, the pre-dynastic cultures, the early dynastic cultures, the merger between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, these are considered key historical transitions within the whole history of North Africa. And in fact, the history of world civilization. And we'll talk about later how under the dynastic period, the rule of many of the pharaohs and monarchs extended beyond Egypt into the area now known as West Asia.
Yes, talk a bit more about Egypt, ancient Egypt, when it was under the control of the pharaohs, an aristocracy, a monarchy, a plutocracy, and they engaged in slavery and often cruel forced labor. Talk about them and what led to their decline, because there's a story I remember when I was learning about ancient Egypt, both in the U.S. and also in Belgium in elementary school, where the decline of the pharaohs was that there was a drought that wouldn't go away. The pharaohs often prayed to the gods for rains, and this time around, that didn't happen. And apparently that led to his violent ouster. But it wasn't the workers themselves, didn't abolish slavery and forced labor, but there was a reconfiguring and a restructuring of how the monarchy and the pharaohs operated. So talk about that and what system was replaced before we talk about how ancient Greece and the Macedonian Empire got in touch with Egypt.
Yes, and that too is subject to considerable amount of debate because obviously, if you look at the ancient temples and later the pyramids and the development of tools and other forms of technology, obviously there was considerable skilled trades in ancient Egypt. There's no way they could have constructed those temples, the pyramids, the human habitation areas without considerable skilled tradesmen that operated in the area. So the question is, what was their status, social status within ancient Egyptian society? Were these skilled tradesmen slaves, or were they something else? Were they skilled craftsmen? So this is a source of a debate that is still going on today as we speak. And then, of course, you had to have engineers, you had to have mathematicians. So yes, there was a considerable amount of skilled trades that were being operated in the area, going back several thousand years. So the building of Abu Simbel, for example, or the pyramids of Giza had to be done by large numbers of people, but the design, the engineering, and also the construction had to be done by people who were highly skilled. Now, this is an interesting point, because I think it was back in the 1970s, there was a book that came out called, I believe it was The Chariot of the Gods, which claimed that perhaps the ancient Egyptian civilization was built by people from outer space. Now, sounds absurd, but these are some of the theories that have existed, over the period, because they can't figure out how people in North Africa and that part of the world could build such advanced civilizations, just based on their own indigenous knowledge and research and engineering capacity. So yeah, there's been a lot of myths surrounding the construction of the dynastic period in Egypt. As I said before, anywhere between 4500 and 3100 BC, which you had the early dynastic period, and then of course reaching its zenith under figures who were very, very prominent during that particular time period. So yes, it's a lot of debate around Egypt and its ancient kingdoms and monarchs and dynasties.
Well, I have to ask this. My own personal curiosity: do historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, and those who study all things Egyptian culture and history know who and why the Sphinx were defaced, the cutting of their noses? And in case people are ignorant and have never learned about Egyptian history, so the Sphinx was this mythological creature. Head of a man or a woman, and the body of a big cat, like like a leopard or a lion type of creature, often gets into sort of mischief and and likes to play around with us humans and whatnot, and for a long time, and still to this day, they were they were defaced. Their noses were defaced, and so do historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, and those who study Egyptian culture, have they finally answered that big mystery of who were the people who defaced the Sphinx, and was it because of racist reasons? And yeah, very curious your response.
Yeah, there was one story saying that when the French came in during the latter part of the 18th century under Napoleon, that a cannon was used to blow off the nose of the Sphinx, indicating that it was some type of racist whitewash or racist cover-up. I'm not sure if that's the exact reasoning behind it, but there are books that are written on this. C.F. Volney, who was a French historian and anthropologist, has written on the ruins of ancient Egypt and ancient Syria. And there are other African scholars who have written on this as well. But we do know there's been a huge debate, which goes all the way up until today, over the racial and ethnic composition of the people who founded ancient Egypt and who maintained control of ancient Egypt throughout the millenniums. So in that regard, the debate still goes on. In fact, just recently, there's been statements made by the former minister of antiquities in Egypt. He's no longer in that position, which objected, for example, to the portrayal of people like Cleopatra and others as being of African origin, and have objected, to her portrayal by people of African descent. Well, to me, this is absurd because, on the one hand, even though Cleopatra ruled during the Ptolemaic period, the Ptolemies, which were the ancient Greeks who did control the state there for a period of time, doesn't mean necessarily that they were absent, that their genetic makeup was absent of any type of African origin as well. So racism, which has been interjected into scholarship and also the rule of various societies, is still impacting how people evaluate the historical development of ancient Egypt. So they will say, well, Cleopatra was Greek, but what does that really mean in regard to what was going on during that time period? We're talking about perhaps 200 to 300 years before the Christian era. And people like William Leo Hansberry, for example, who was a professor at Howard University from the 1920s up until the 1960s, he did extensive research and lecturing on the African presence in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And what he discovered was that there was a presence not only on the African continent, but also in the Mediterranean islands and on the Greek mainland. So we'll have to do more research, but I think the racism that was brought in by the French and the British in later years has also infected the historical methodology and how things are viewed, and also it impacts as well the whole concept of the origins of ancient Egypt, Sudan, as well as civilizations in West Asia as well. Because as I mentioned before, during the period, the so-called highest period of civilization in Egypt, and in other parts of North and East Africa, there was the expansion of those civilizations into Asia. And that is very, very important to recognize. So people assume that African people were strictly confined to certain parts of the African continent, which is not true. That you had the outmigration of Africans, and you also had the expansion of their rule in other parts of the world. In West Asia, we know, and also in parts of Europe as well.
I actually have a question about Cleopatra, but I'll get to that much later. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So then I have to ask this. Question: what was Egypt like when it was semi-colonized and had strong economic and political ties? First with the ancient Greeks, the ancient Greek empires, and later the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great.
Yes, that's very, very important because these were huge civilizations that covered a tremendous amount of geographic area in North Africa, in Europe, as well as in Asia. But even prior to the advent of the Greek dominance in Egypt and other parts of North Africa, you had other groups that came from West Asia. For example, the Hittites were one of the groups that have been designated as West Asians, who also took control of Egypt during a brief period of time. And also the Hyksos was another group, ostensibly from West Asia, who also took control. And this took place somewhere between the 16th and the 15th century before the Christian era. And there was resistance on the part of the original Egyptians or the indigenous Egyptians to the outside control and invasions by both the Hyksos as well as the Hittites. And even after that, there was the intervention of the Persians, which took place around 600 BC as well. So even prior to the Greeks and the Romans, there were people who were there from West Asia, but the ethnic composition of these groups also are up for the debate. Because if the African Egyptians who were Africans and Ethiopians and Sudanese had gone to that area, for example, the area is now known as Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, and they were able to exercise their control there for several centuries, then the question is, what was the ethnic composition of the Hyksos as well as the Hittites and others that came into Egypt in later years. We're talking about the perhaps the 4th century BC with the ancient Greeks and later the Romans around the period of the transition between the so-called before Christ historical period and the period after the birth of Christ and the beginning of the Christian era. So most definitely, the debate continues around these issues, and these debates still shape how ancient Egyptian history is viewed today.
And what was Egypt like when it was semi-colonized and had strong economic and political ties to the ancient Greeks and later the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great?
Well, a lot of people still maintain their culture, but at the same time, a lot of the ancient Greek culture was adopted by people in Egypt. And the same situation occurred under the Romans several centuries later. But yes, this was the situation that their culture had an impact, and so did the Romans. But going back though, with people like Herodotus, for example, the Greek historian who wrote during the 5th century AD, 5th century BC, his description of ancient Egypt indicates that it was a very advanced civilization, that the people were Black, and that the ancient Greeks learned a lot of the basics of what became their civilization from the Egyptians. Now, this is also a controversial assertion because on the one hand, the European historical scholars indicate that Herodotus is the, quote, father of history, unquote. Yet, his writings on ancient Egypt and ancient Africa, indicating that it was much more advanced than what was going on in Europe at the time, has been dismissed by more modern day European historians. For example, William Leo Hansberry, who I mentioned before, who taught at Howard University for many years, and he attended Harvard, but he did not receive, could not, my understanding was he could not receive a PhD from Harvard because of his basic thesis that Africans were the originators and influences of ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. And during the 20th century, people at Harvard, the scholars at Harvard, would not accept that assertion. But he did get a bachelor's and a master's degree from Harvard, and this allowed him to teach at Howard University, where he also ran into extensive controversy at Howard from other professors there. Now, I've been trying to find out who these other professors were that were attempting to get him fired as early as the 1920s. I have not been able to uncover that information. Nonetheless, his classes were extremely popular at Howard University. In fact, people had to wait for years to be able to enroll in his classes. That's just how popular they were, that they were jammed every single semester. That's how fascinated he was as a lecturer, historical lecturer. So yes, that whole controversy around Herodotus and other Greek historians goes on up until this day.
And also, it's also important to mention that when the ancient Greeks and later the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, when they semi-colonized or fully colonized Egypt, Egyptians weren't Egyptians weren't considered citizens, so they weren't allowed to vote. I believe there was some forms of slavery and other forms of economic exploitations of the average Egyptian. So that's important to note in the historical records. So what was Egypt like? So after the decline of the Macedonian Empire, what was Egypt like before the ancient Roman Empire rose, and how did Egypt become semi-colonized and have strong socio-economic and political ties with the ancient Roman Empire?
Yeah, but just to point out that the ancient Greeks and the Romans also enslaved their own people.
Yes,
So that's important to figure out. Only certain people were considered, quote, citizens, unquote. And, even the Roman so-called democracy was only a democracy for certain people. It did not
exactly,
encompass necessarily the
and women
masses.
in both civilizations weren't allowed to vote. In fact, I mean the patriarchy was actually out of this world. Both the institutional patriarchy, the institutional misogyny, the institutional pedastry of international of both ancient Greece and to a large extent ancient Rome, the normalization of the abuse of children by often older male was also quite grotesque, as well as the torture, the brutal subjugations of colonial subjects and so forth. All of that needs to be on the record because because it's bizarre. When I was a kid, learning about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, it's just bizarre how all of that is very minimized
Yes,
when your elementary school teachers are teaching about this. It's just so crazy how all of that is very minimized. And then as you grow up, you start thinking about all of these historical subjects, and then when you actually kind of like revisit it, you go, geez, these are pretty brutal civilizations, and like no wonder the West kind of is what it is. So I feel the need to mention
yeah.
that.
But I didn't find out about those issues until I got to university in the humanities, which they did openly, admit the pedophilia that went on, but it was mainly among the elites
Yeah.
that engaged in this. The common people, were too busy working on their farms or other trades to be engaged in that type of abuse of children. So, that's one thing to consider in that particular regard. But yes, the ancient Greek civilizations through overexpansion, went into decline, and this brought about the rise of the Ptolemaic civilization and their takeover of Egypt.
And talk about when Egypt was colonized by ancient Rome. What were the conditions of the people? And yeah, talk briefly about that, and then I have a question about Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. But yeah, first answer
Yeah,
that.
I think they continued the high level of civilization that had been in existence for several thousand years. They didn't come in with a blank slate, neither did the Greeks. And this is something that is often overlooked, by Western historians, that, the high civilization of that period was a direct outcome of Greece and Rome, when in fact the Greeks and the Romans could not have accomplished what they did without the initial contributions of the ancient Egyptians, Sudanese, as well as Ethiopians in the North East Africa region. So yes, that's very, very important to keep in mind. And the ancient Romans, during their control of the area, they set up Alexandria, which was actually founded under the Greeks. They set it up as a major center of learning, and that was very, very important. And you had scholars who came about during that particular time period, one of which was a woman, Hypatia, who was a prominent scholar during that particular time period under Roman control. So it was and still remained a high point of civilization, yet there were class divisions which existed, and there was brutality, of course, among the common people. But people were recruited into the Roman military, and they continued their colonization efforts throughout various parts of North Africa as well as Asia.
And from my understanding, when doing some research via ChatGPT and Google AI and so forth, was that actually the ancient Romans were even more brutal towards Egypt as a colony compared to ancient Roman what even existed before that. So
Yeah.
that's a great segue to this question, which is, what is the socio-economic legacy and even foreign policy legacy of Queen Cleopatra, and what was her skin color, as it's often a source of controversy that she wasn't looking like Dame
Elizabeth
Elizabeth
Taylor.
Taylor. And as you already mentioned, there was a Netflix adaptation of her story, and she was played by a Black Afro descendants actress. And quite frankly, there was a lot of racism coming largely from Egyptians and others of an Arabic Middle Eastern background. And but it's also important to also clarify something. The U.S. The U.S. has a unique subculture amongst the Black community of Black nationalism, and sometimes it will go into ridiculous ahistorical decoration, directions like Beethoven was originally Black, and that's and
Karl Marx.
you, you,
There's been
that Karl Marx was originally Black and stuff like that. And now
or had
Cleopatra,
black blood. Yeah, right.
exactly, and Cleopatra has found herself in that. Now, apparently, in ancient Rome, its media and propaganda at the time largely denigrated her and how she looked. So, what's the real truth then? And then talk about her relations with Julius Caesar. If there's any important information you want to share about him, feel free to explain. And then what led to her downfall when Marc Antony was trying to be a faithful successor to Caesar, but a civil war ensued. He and Cleopatra were killed, or they did a double suicide. And then we saw the fall of ancient Rome, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire with Christianity as its state religion. Please do talk about that, and who succeeded Cleopatra, and how was power enacted in Egypt under the Holy Roman Empire. So I know that's
Yeah,
a
I don't know if we
bunch of
can
questions,
clearly.
but go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if we can clearly define what the racial origin of Cleopatra was. The Cleopatra that was involved with Marc Antony, who, according to the legend, committed suicide, and then she, of course, died in the aftermath of that. But I think that there needs to be more research, and I don't know if any remains have been found, whose DNA could be tested to make that determination. But yes, it was under the decline, of the ancient Greek Empire, the Ptolemies, and the rise of the Roman Empire in North Africa. But I don't think that we can clearly say, what her racial origins were. But at the same time, you cannot discount the fact that there was African and European intermarriage during the ancient period, and that the level of racism or the racial categories which exist today and have existed since the 15th and 16th century are necessarily categorically to be implemented in regard to the ancients. And that goes true for Egypt as well. We know that the ancient indigenous Egyptians were Africans, but at the same time, as civilization developed, particularly during the dynastic period, that there was an expansion of the ancient Egyptian dynastic civilizations into Asia.
When pe-
So,
and when people argue, when some archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians argue that Cleopatra, she was neither looking like Elizabeth Taylor, but neither an Afro descendant Black woman, that she was
like Nefertiti or somebody, yeah, right,
yeah, that
yeah,
she was that she was of Macedonian Greek, but definitely did not have you know white skin like what we often see in Western Europe, or even Eastern Europe for that matter, or Russia, or the United States and Canada, the largely white population, but that she had some sort of of a tan, what they call olive oil skin, whatever that means.
Olive skinned, yeah, right.
So now, having been to Italy a couple, I think I've been to Italy about like 4 times, and having and even seeing Bulgarians and some Eastern Europeans, there are some who more or less have kind of a light complexion, like the skin I have. Of course, with with the sand, with the sun, anyone who was very white would have been very much tanned. So lots of people argue that if Jesus was to exist, there's no way he would have been a blonde, blue-eyed white person.
Yeah.
If anything, he would have had. If anything, he would have had a very tanned skins,
Yes.
such as this. Some argue that that he was an Arabic Palestinian and so forth. So, I kind of lean more towards towards that when we talk about Cleopatra, and so I'm curious your response on that, and then talk to us about her socioeconomic legacy and her foreign policy with respect to Julius Caesar and later Marc Antony.
Yeah, I think they were attempting to make an alliance to maintain the Roman Empire and its influence, which in the long term did not necessarily work out. But in ancient Rome, for example, there was tremendous amount of persecution of ordinary people. Even the story of Jesus is centered around the persecution of his family by the Roman emperors of the period. Yeah, in terms of the ethnic origin of Jesus, for example, is subjected to tremendous controversy as well. I mean, there are people, particularly in the United States, right here in the city of Detroit, church, the Shrine of the Black Madonna, which was formed during the 1960s and early 1970s. They created a portrait of the Black Madonna. Now, in Europe, there are depictions of Jesus's mother as being a Black woman, the Black Madonna. So,
interesting.
This is quite interesting. And so in this country, in Detroit, in fact, during the 1960s, there was controversy generated by the Shrine of the Black Madonna Church, which was initially the Central Congregational Church. And Reverend Albert Clay, who was the minister of that church, played an instrumental role in terms of Black nationalist ideology, the shifting of Christianity as being a African-centered religion as opposed to being a European-centered religion. And there's some basis historically from what they were articulating during that particular time period. And the whole notion that an oppressed people, African people inside the United States and even on the African continent, should be looking up and bowing down and praying to a Jesus Christ or a God that resembles their oppressors from an ideological and philosophical standpoint is problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very, very interesting when you look at the creation of the image of Jesus Christ, the creation of the notion of a supreme being, which originated, as far as we know, in ancient Egypt, the whole concept of monotheism, of one God.
Yeah.
Where in many societies prior to that, and even today, they have what they call polytheism, the notion that there are many gods, but there may be one superior God. But at the same time, in ancient Egypt, the whole notion of monotheism is said to have originated during that time period. So we don't have photographs, we don't have even depictions of Jesus Christ until much later. But in terms of the origins of the organized Christian church, it is well documented that it started in Egypt around 70 AD by a man named Saint Mark.
Uh-huh.
And the Coptic church which is considered the original Christian church, started in Egypt around that particular time period. And Coptic is interesting as well because that is a language that the Egyptians spoke long before Arabic became a state language inside the country. So you had the ancient Egyptian languages, which is known as the hieroglyphics or the Meta Neter. And then, of course, with the influence of Greece as a language, as a culture, and also the Romans, ancient Roman languages. Latin, for example, is one of them.
Uh-huh.
But the Coptics, who are Egyptians, have their own language, and they formed the first organized Christian church several decades after the purported crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which probably took place around 33 AD.
And that's quite, and that's that, and that's quite fascinating.
Yeah,
Of itself. Fela Kuti, who we did a program.
yes, last year.
Yes, and of course quite the radical indigenous African advocate that he was. He argued that we shouldn't be praying to Christianity or to Islam because these are all exported into our continents, and there is a lot of truth. I mean, you can argue that Islam was also exported from West Asia and the Persian Empire into Egypt and the rest of Africa. So I always find that interesting, and I think there certainly is a kernel of truth on both sides.
Yes, and it is an ongoing debate, and but in terms of the historical record, the first organized Christian church was started in Egypt, which is in North Africa, and as I said before, Egypt, Sudan, and also Ethiopia. There's not the same geographical boundaries in ancient times that exist today, the post-colonial period, and we can talk about that later. But yes, there were Christian communities, churches, and even empires that existed in ancient Sudan, which existed for centuries, as well as in Egypt.
Before we go deeper into that, just talk to us about what was Cleopatra's socioeconomic legacy and her foreign policy legacy with respect to her relations with Julius Caesar, who was also her lover, and Marc Antony. Yeah, talk to us about that.
Well, they had what we would consider in the modern times as an imperial ambition. They wanted to spread their civilizations and their culture and their language to other parts of the world. What was considered the known world at that time, which was Southern Europe, North and East Africa, and West Asia, and even extended to the Far East. So yes, and they were not able to do what their objectives were, but it did not signal the complete decline of Roman civilization, which took a period of 4 to 5 centuries. It still existed, even though there was a split between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western portion of the empire, and even a split within the Christian church, which took place because you had the Orthodox Christians, which grew out of the Coptic church and the original Christians beginning in the first century AD. And as a result
sorry to interrupt, but ironically, last weekend, the great Marxist historian Michael Parenti sadly passed away at the age of 92 from, I believe, from complications to dementia. He has an extraordinary book called The Assassination of Julius Caesar.
Right.
Which is an incredible book because when I learned about Julius Caesar, I always thought, now, putting aside a lot of his genocidal campaigns
Right.
and how grotesque ancient Rome was, but I was always of the opinion, of a leftist opinion, that Julius Caesar was kind of anti-establishment. It was very much for the regular people, the regular soldiers, and so forth, and wanted them to have more rights. Hence, why he was brutally murdered by by the senators and so forth, which actually led to the decline of ancient Rome as we speak. So Parenti argues this in his book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar. So that's why I'm quite curious. Cleopatra. Now, she's not a flaming left winger, but was she somebody who definitely was trying to fight for more sovereignty for her people, and
Yes.
and if her and her relations with Julius Caesar had continued, there would have been much more rights for Egyptian subjects, because then after Julius Caesar is murdered, Marc Antony was supposed to sort of be the successor to Julius Caesar, but he was clashing with Caesar's relative Octavian. Brutal civil war, which actually led to the decline of the Roman Republic. But then Christianity becomes a new state religion, and then it becomes
Yes.
the Roman Empire. And then Cleopatra, of course, some argue she was murdered, others argued she did a suicide pact with Marc Antony. So I'm very curious your
Yeah.
response.
Yeah. These are questions that are still being debated. We're talking about 2,000 years later. What was her impact? Did she want to bring more democracy in the ancient sense to ancient Egypt, perhaps? But at the same time, it was not to be, and it's very difficult to predict or to go back and say, well, if this individual had not died or had not been born or had not taken this particular act, things may have been totally different. The trajectory of history may have been completely different. And I tend to shy away from that type of analysis. I tend to look at more of the material conditions and the interaction of human society with their material conditions, the social forces that are in operation. I tend to lean more in that direction as opposed to looking at the idea that these individuals, although important, actually shaped the historical trajectory. People could argue, for example, that if St. Mark had never existed, there never would have been an organized Christian church, perhaps. But at the same time, the people who were advancing Christianity as a religion could have gone on and still established the Coptic Church. They had a language, they had a land, they had a general worldview, and that was spread throughout North Africa and other parts of Europe, as well as Asia. So you mentioned that around the 4th century, that the Roman Empire at that time adopted Christianity as a state religion. At the Conference of Nicaea, which was around 333 AD. But there was still this split between the Orthodox Christians and the Christians who follow Rome, and that still exists today. Now, there have been efforts to try to ameliorate the differences between the Orthodox Christians and those who came out of the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, the Pope today, Pope Leo the 14th, who was of African descent, it was discovered, was traced back to Louisiana, the so-called Creoles of Louisiana, which is another very complicated designation. Because in Louisiana, they have all these different categories related to race. They talk about the Creoles, which are often people of mixed race, but not necessarily so. They would have categories like mulattoes, for example, quadroons, octoroons, the one drop rule. So I guess the mulattoes are people who are 50% African, 50% European. The quadroons are people who have 25% African ancestry. The octoroons are people who have 1/4.
Yes,
No, 1/8.
as a
Octoroons have 1/8
yes,
African ancestry. And
yes,
then they go on to say, well, anybody who has any African blood is Black. So the one drop rule, which you could be even 1/25% African. If you could pass for white, fine. But if you're discovered to have this African ancestry, then you have to go back to the category of the African people. And this, people attribute this to Louisiana and New Orleans and so forth, but it was largely true throughout the United States as a whole. So you had the division in the Christian church between the Roman church and the Orthodox church. And the Orthodox church eventually took up their residence in Istanbul in Turkey. So, and then in subsequent centuries, there were all types of splits within the Christian religion, going all the way up to the 16th century, of course, when Martin Luther broke and formed the so-called Protestant church, which was during the 1600s. And of course, in ancient English history, we look at Henry VIII, who broke with the Church of Rome and set up the Church of England because he didn't feel that, the British at that time should be bowing down to the Romans in regard to their religious orientation.
He really wanted to divorce his wife, who couldn't bear him.
Yeah, right.
Couldn't bear him a son.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect segue into this question. So what was Egypt like during the Middle Ages? What was it like to live in Egypt during the Middle Ages, where across Europe it was in steep decline with the fall of the Roman Empire, but there was the ongoing advancement of Christianity, and with that there was the rise of the horrendous system of feudalism, later mercantilism. These are the precursors of capitalism with its aristocracy and plutocracy, and the horrendous exploitation of labor, namely that of farmers. So I'm curious, what was Egypt like during this time, and was Egypt free for a period of time without a European power indirectly ruling them and trying to meddle in their socio-economic, political, and cultural affairs?
Yes, there was constant rebellion, even under the Greeks and the Romans. And then later, of course, we had the so-called Islamic conquest, which took place during the 7th century, where you had Arab tribes in West Asia who invaded Egypt and other parts of North Africa. And of course, many of the people there were converted to Islam. Nonetheless, Christianity was able to maintain itself in Egypt, in Ethiopia, as well as in Sudan. And in the area now known as Sudan, particularly in the north, there were Christian kingdoms that fought against the Islamic conquest for centuries. They didn't succumb until much later, which is considered the period of the Middle Ages. So there was an ongoing struggle between those who wanted to impose Islam and those who wanted to maintain their Christian as well as their traditional religious beliefs, which is described as animism. And the whole concept of animism is that people engage in what they describe as ancestor worship, and that they believe in the potential for more than one God or polytheism.
Yeah.
These are concepts, of course, that were imposed by the West, but the organized Christian church, the organized Islamic religion met resistance on both sides. And of course, the Holy Lands, the areas considered the Holy Lands, the Crusades came about from the Christians who wanted to take back the so-called Holy Lands and other areas from the people who were Muslim, who were bringing in their religion as well. So this went on for centuries, the conflict between the people who considered themselves Christians and those who considered themselves Muslims. And there were Africans who were on both sides of that struggle. I don't think we can designate it as a racial struggle.
Yeah.
I mentioned about the Sudanese Christian kingdoms and the Coptic Church and the religious adherence to Christianity in Egypt and also in Ethiopia as well. In fact, in Ethiopia, the Christianity as an organized religion was adopted as early as the 4th and 5th century. And they even built churches within the mountains in Ethiopia to ostensibly to stave off the invasion of the adherents to Islam. And those churches still exist today, although they need a tremendous amount of rehabilitation and refurbishment, which will require a tremendous amount of investment on the part of the Ethiopians and others outside of Ethiopia. And in terms of the Holy Book as well, the Ethiopians had their own Bible written in the language of Ge'ez, which is a traditional Ethiopian language. So you have the Ethiopian Bible, which still exists today, but the Ge'ez language,
and that's unique Ethiopian language and the unique language that the Coptic Christian Church of Egypt has. So they have their own language, and is that very similar to the sect of Judaism that speaks Yiddish? Some of the Orthodox Jewish synagogues that speak Yiddish.
Yeah, I think Yiddish is more of a, in my opinion, and many scholars say they're more of an authentic European Jewish language as opposed to Hebrew, which many people say is something that was resurrected in modern period as a language for the state of Israel, for the Zionist entity. But Yiddish, yeah, in fact, even in the United States, a lot of Jewish immigrants from Europe, particularly from Southern Europe, can speak Yiddish. And it is a written language. They've had Yiddish newspapers in cities like New York, for example, Yiddish literature and theater, which functioned up until probably the early part of the 20th century.
And apparently, ironically, Yiddish is in a state of decline, and the recognized language of Israel. I've been to Israel is or historic Palestine, however folks want to frame it, but the state of Israel. Hebrew is its official language, and yet Yiddish is not a second official language. Although some communities, some expat communities who are from the Orthodox Church, and some of them are also very anti-Zionist.
Yeah, it's interesting.
They speak Yiddish amongst each other, but they are almost afraid that Yiddish is going to be a lost language, an extinct language, because of the dominance of Hebrew and Israeli nationalism, ultra nationalism. Israeli emphasis on the Hebrew and not Yiddish, which I find quite interesting. In and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, if the European Jewish community, and I think it would probably have to come from the United States, they would have to take action to try to restore the language or to preserve the language. The Coptic language, for example, is not spoken widely, outside the Christian church in Egypt, which still exists because of the dominance of Arabic, as a language, and also English, because what happened was that during the period around the 18th, 19th century, you had the intervention of France and then later Britain. And their influence was quite, dominant, with the construction of the Suez Canal and the establishment of the British protectorate in Egypt. But let's go back. We talked about the Islamic conquests, but even prior to that, there was of course, the issue of the Ottoman Turks,
Yes, in fact, I
The
actually have a
Ottoman
question.
Turks.
Yes, because
Yeah,
according to Google AI, when I asked this question, during the European Renaissance and the Age of
yeah.
Enlightenment, Egypt was under the thumb of the Ottoman Empire. So, explain the rise of the Ottoman Empire and how they later colonized or semi-colonized Egypt, and how did the Egyptians, the average working class Egyptians, fare mostly under the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, around the 15th, 16th century, you had the rise of the Ottoman Empire, not just in Egypt, but in other areas of North Africa as well as West Asia. So this is very, very important to acknowledge. And they uh, had dominance perhaps 3 to 4 centuries, even in North Africa. They were in Libya. They had outposts in Tunisia as well. And they were largely Islamic, but their form of rule was largely indirect, that if you accepted the dominance of the Ottoman Empire, they largely would allow you to rule indirectly on their behalf. So this is very, very interesting. And they came, of course, into conflict with the rise of the European colonial powers, such as Britain and France. And they pretty much fell into decline during the beginning of World War One. Their empire pretty much collapsed. And after that, they have not really been a force, although modern Turkey, particularly under people like Tayyip Erdogan, some people suggest they want to try to rebuild their influence internationally. They
In fact,
have a lot of involvement in places like Somalia and other countries in Africa in an effort to extend their influence, whether that's going to be possible or not, because they're part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization since 1953, I believe. And but you do see conflict taking place between Turkey and the United States, as well as other European countries. They have tried to get into the European Union and they've been denied on several occasions. So I think there's a lot of apprehension over the actual aims and objectives of the Turkish state, or Turkey, as they have been called recently. So yes, you had the rise of the Islamic uh, uh, so-called empire, the Islamic conquest, the building of mosques, the imposition of the Arabic language, then of course the Ottoman Turks, which came about in the 15th and 16th century, that of course lived for many years, and that influence. And then after that, of course, the influence of France and later the British. And that would bring us up to
and
more of the modern period.
in fact, can you talk to us a bit more about when the Ottoman Empire indirectly, ruled over Egypt? And I think the late Edward Said would be very happy. When I mentioned the following, of course, he was a very well known Palestinian American post-colonial writer, academic, and of course he coins the term Orientalism. Now, if I understand him correctly, he basically so if I understand him correctly, and of course he taught at Columbia University in the United States in New York. Now basically his whole thesis was that was that Western understanding of North Africa, the Middle East, what some people would call West Asia, was highly oversimplistic, highly racist and whatnot. In that their depictions of these civilizations was that they were always backward and stuff like that. When actually these were cradles of civilizations, these were cradles of modernity. And of course it's not widely known, but so much of mathematics, geometry, astrology, and so forth, and even just culture itself, like fashion and whatnot. A lot of it comes from ancient Egypt. A lot of it comes from these lands that Britain and France later colonized,
Right.
uh, and that the Ottoman Empire. Now I'm not saying that everything was all hunky dory under the Ottoman Empire. Not everything was all hunky-dory under the Persian Empire.
No.
But to say that it was all backwards, that it was all reactionary Islam, and it was all brutal slavery and racism and so forth, would be doing a disservice to that history, because there were people known as Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman the Great, and so forth, and that actually for quite a long period of time, uh, if you were if you were a certain Christian that was persecuted, if you were a Jew that was persecuted during the brutal Middle Ages of Europe, you actually
Yes.
found safe haven in the in the Ottoman Empire. A lot of Armenian some of the oldest Christian civilizations, the Armenians, even when they were being persecuted by the Ottomans, found safe haven in Syria, in Iraq, and so forth. So yes, so long story short, we would be doing a disservice to history if we said that that all there was from the Ottoman empires and from the Persian empires was just brutal persecution, and so forth. So I'm curious your response on that.
Yeah, there was differences of opinion in that regard. For example, Jewish people, a lot of them did find refuge within the so-called Islamic world during that particular time period. So the notion that is often advanced by Zionism, that it was necessary to set up the state of Israel in Palestine, not in Europe, which was the Europeans, the Germans, and others were the architects of the Holocaust during the 1930s and 1940s. And even prior to that, with the persecution of Jewish merchants and Jewish population groups, they did receive refuge and even protection within various Islamic societies. And you find that even today, Jewish people, for example, in Iran, still have synagogues where they practice their religion, and they're not being harassed or being arrested by the Iranian government, even under the Islamic Republic of Iran over the last 47 years. So yes, this is a notion that can be debunked, by actual historical documentation, that the whole idea of anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jewish people is a relative modern phenomenon, that it did not go back thousands upon thousands of years, or that the Muslims and the Arabs had some role in this, and therefore justifying the conquering of the state of Palestine and the elimination and displacement of their population, which is ongoing today.
In fact, some of the oldest Christian civilizations are in historic Palestine. So
Yes,
there actually and there actually is a Palestinian Christian community, and it's
fairly significant. Yes.
and again, when now, of course, when the Ottoman Empire was starting to decline and it became known as the sick man of Europe, that is when that was when the Ottoman Empire was being more racist and being more persecutory of their Greek subjects, their Armenian subjects, and a lot of Armenian Christians who escaped from the horrendous Armenian genocide, which was done by the Ottoman Empire, and the rise of the Young Turks. Again, a lot of them found refuge in Syria, in Iraq, and also in historic Palestine. So these are some of the oldest Christian so these are some of the oldest Christian communities, and so it's always interesting, because even the early Palestinian resistance groups, and even the Fatah and the Palestinian Liberation Organization led by Yasser Arafat and the late Swab Erekat, they were secular.
Yeah,
They were
largely.
actually, they were secular. So it's just it's just and again, this goes back to the Orientalism that that Edward Said was talking about, because in the eyes of the Western world, these Palestinians, they're all just a bunch of, Muslims, and they don't want to have, peace with with Israelis, with Israeli Jews. But it's actually the opposite. It's actually the opposite. It's Israel as an ethnocracy that does not want to live peacefully coexistence with its indigenous Palestinians that include Palestinian Christians, secular Palestinians, and whatnot, correct?
Yes, and even in more modern times, during the earliest phase, this latest phase of genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, there was a Christian church which had been there since the 5th century that was bombed by the Israeli occupation forces. And they played it down. But that is the reality of the situation, that there are Christians in Palestine, in Egypt, and in Syria and Iraq. So these are not Islamic extremist states. This is why ISIS and Al-Qaeda are really an aberration of traditional Islamic, Arabic, and African civilizations, that they're imposing this type of intolerance. And of course, you can trace back the origins of these groups to U.S. intelligence. In Afghanistan, in regard to Al-Qaeda, and in Syria and Iraq as it relates to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And these groups, their ideology has been spread even into other parts of Asia as well as Africa. We can see what's going on in Nigeria now, where the JNIM has been cited there. In Mali, for example, which has a long history of Islamic and traditional religious practices. This type of intolerance has been imposed, but in actuality, they're there to bring about destruction and chaos and division on behalf of imperialism. Objectively, that's exactly what they are doing.
That's actually a perfect segue to this question. So we've talked about the Ottoman Empire and how it wasn't and that it wasn't all horrendous under the Ottoman Empire until the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which came about because of World War One. The Ottoman Empire sided with the Axis allies of Germany, and that gives us the rise of the British Empire in Egypt. So my last question as we wrap up part one of this discussion was, how did the British Empire come to acquire Egypt as a colony, and what were the conditions of the Egyptians under British colonialism?
Well, you had the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and you had the intervention of France as well as Britain. In 1869, they constructed the modern-day Suez Canal, which was a pathway to facilitate trade between Africa, West Asia, and Europe. And they considered themselves as the owners of the Suez Canal, the British as well as the French. And the imposition of colonialism brought about a British protectorate or British colonial system between the 1880s all the way up to 1922. And the ostensible independence of Egypt in 1922 actually grew out of a revolutionary upsurge, an uprising in 1919. And perhaps we can talk about that in the next episode, because this signaled the rise of modern day Egypt, the revolution of 1919. But prior to that, there were nationalist movements, largely under the banner of the WAF party, that came into existence that demanded independence for Egypt.
And what were the conditions of the Egyptians under British colonialism?
It was horrendous. Repression, economic exploitation, the denial of actual citizenship among the people, collaboration between the monarchical interests and the colonialists. Yes, and you also had the expansion of Egypt into what is now known as Sudan, in the
Talk
northern
a bit
part of
more about that,
Sudan.
actually.
They were actually controlled jointly as an Egyptian Anglo configuration. But the conditions were very bad, and that's prompted the rise of the nationalist movement. It manifested itself in politics as well as literature and music as well.
And before we close, talk a bit more about Egypt being a colonial proxy of Britain when it comes to the former United Sudan.
Yeah, well, what happened was that after the conclusion of World War One, the fact that the United States was not subjected to fighting internally, and they were reluctant to even get into the war. Even the ruling class interests, there were interests in the ruling class that were opposed to entry because they saw it as a potential destruction of their workforce and large-scale casualties in regard to the war. But then when Woodrow Wilson, who initially said he was against the war, decided to get into it, when they convinced the industrialists like Henry Ford and others that they could actually make money off building war armaments, that they got involved in 1917 and actually outlawed any criticism of the war through the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act later. That these were both in 1917. So yes, after that, the U.S. Gained a lot of power, but Britain still had tremendous influence and maintained their colonies, and that didn't fall apart until after during World War II, and also the conclusion of World War II, and at the same time, the United States was bombed by Imperial Japan at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, but there was no invasion of the United States. It largely remained intact, so they were able to emerge during the war and after the war as the most dominant imperial power in the world.
Well, that's a perfect place to end. And next week we're going to cover Egypt and the rise of its independence, and yeah, Egypt during the Cold War, Egypt in the 1990s, and current affairs. So we were joined on this edition of One Plus One with our always wonderful returning champion and our historical tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Check out his work and that of his colleagues and comrades at both websites. Donate generously to both and subscribe to them. And please remember to share One Plus One's work, our playlist, our past and new, and our most recent episodes. Donate to One Plus One if you can. And next week, we'll continue part 2 of our history and looking at the current affairs of Egypt. Until then, good night and good luck, folks. Have a great weekend and all of my best.